Hi, this is Debbie from Lime Doodle Design, and thank you for joining me for Doodling with Debbie. Today I'm showing one of the quickest ways to colour a floral set, and that is to create a lovely ink blended background and then white heat emboss on top. You get all the beautiful line work of the flowers while the colour scheme hints at warm summer days. All you need to finish it off is a statement sentiment piece and you're done. And just so you know, all products used in my card today are listed and linked below for your convenience. When the new Saltwater Taffy Distress colour was released, I played around with this ink combination and the piece sat on my desk and kept catching my eye. I love the warm ice cream tones which melt into a grounding of darker colour. From experience, I've learned that it is good practice from playing around and experimenting to always make a note of what supplies you've used on the back. So you can see here that I used Simon Says Stamp £130 white card, along with scattered straw, dried marigold, saltwater taffy and frayed burlap distress oxides. So I'm using £130 white card from Simon. I like the weightiness of this card, but also the smooth surface is perfect for ink blending. I have a tonic easy clean mat on my work surface to keep it clean, and for today I used a disposable glove on my left hand. Since COVID, I keep a pack of these around, and wearing a glove on the hand that holds the paper down will prevent any fingerprints in the ink blending as I turn and move the card around. Starting with scattered straw and slowly blending the colour from the base of the card, I worked the ink up until I'd covered almost a third of the area. This enables me to bring in the next colour, dried marigold, and overlap with a portion of the scattered straw, while still leaving a portion at the end of the original yellow colour. The blending for this portion of the video is speeded up, but really it doesn't take long because of that smooth surface and these delicious buttery inks. They blend together so easily. I used the scattered straw brush to smooth out the blend from the dried marigold and then worked on to Saltwater Taffy. I'm not a massive fan of pink, but this soft coral peach tones of Saltwater Taffy won me over straight away. I blended Saltwater Taffy over the edge of the dried marigold area and moved it up and almost to the end of the piece of card. I used the dried marigold brush to smooth the blend out between the two and then moved on to frayed burlap. Using a neutral colour in the mix helps ground the piece, but also to contrast with the ice cream tones and prevents the card from becoming too sugary and sweet for this mucky, muted tone-loving person. I softened the blend between the brown and pink with a pink brush and then took a final sweep of each brush over their respective areas to finish the blend, and also each brush would have picked up a little of the frayed burlap from the mat and muted the tones a touch. Now the next phase is important for clean embossing. Make sure the panel is fully dry before trying to heat emboss anything on top. The inks are a little wet and you want to make sure that it is all gone, otherwise the embossing powder will stick everywhere. One trick I picked up from Christina Werner to check if it's properly dry is to sprinkle embossing powder onto the surface before you try any inking. I was happy that I dried this off enough. For extra insurance, I treated the panel with anti-static powder before moving on to stamping the beautiful bouquet set in Versamark ink. Now I'm including my mistakes and all into this video. For some reason, my brain decided to set up the MISTI for a cling mounted stamp, and I removed the foam piece from the base to allow for the extra depth of a cling set. I stamped the piece once before I realised my error, but by that point I already had some of the image marking the surface of the panel. If I tried to lift the piece and put the foam underneath and then stamp again, I'd never be able to align it with what I'd already stamped. And so I made do by adding extra pressure to the drawer of the MISTI as I stamped and managed to get a good enough impression. I sprinkled the sticky ink with white embossing powder and then heat set with a hot heat tool. I love the writing style in this old letter stamp set, and so to add extra interest to the areas of the background, I inked the stamp in Versamark ink and then rolled small sections of the image onto the background. You can see the ink glistening in the lights, and I apologise for the glare at times, but trying to get enough light in Scotland in the winter is a continuous battle. My initial thought was to leave the Versamark ink as a subtle tone-on-tone in the background, and so I moved on to splatter. For me, there will always be a splattering section to any card. I pressed Saltwater Taffy and dried Marigold Distress Oxide inks onto the craft mat and then picked up the colour with a wet brush to splatter over the card. Because Distress Oxides are opaque, you can splatter lighter colours over darker ones and they still show up. I also added a good splatter of white gouache. The white droplets lift and lighten the colour scheme and give everything a lovely airy feel. I dried off the piece and I decided to emphasise the old letter text with some Saltwater Taffy glaze. Versamark ink stays sticky for quite some time, and so I was still able to sprinkle glaze onto the areas of the text despite having spent time splattering and drying off the panel. I melted the glaze with my heat tool, and the glaze adds that pop of colour and definition to the text, and also a glossy finish for extra interest. I moved around the panel, adding glaze to the 5 spots of the text. The way the definition then comes and goes with the intermittent glaze versus Versamark on its own is lovely. If all the text had been glazed, it would have become more static and less interesting. I added some extra white splatter along the text side, and this helps everything blend together. I cut the panel down to be just slightly smaller than an A2 card base, and while I was doing so, I also cut and scored an A2 card base from Sam Says Stamp's ivory card. The background was pretty enough that I didn't need much to finish it off. I chose to use the statement sentiment piece with the Here For You dies. I cut the lettering from a scrap of the £130 white card I'd used for the background, and once I'd removed the words from the card and fiddled out the little extra bits, I then pressed the letters with Versamark ink. You can press the die cuts directly into the ink pad to make sure you've hit every spot. And then I sprinkled with Saltwater Taffy glaze. This will tie the sentiment piece to the background, and also that lovely glaze really catches your eye and draws you in. I added a second coat of Versamark ink and repeated the process of sprinkling with the glaze and then heat setting. It's a bit of a fiddly process with the die cut wiggling around in the breeze from the heat tool, but I got there in the end. You could mount the sentiment die cut directly onto the card front, but being of similar colours, it doesn't stand out as much as I'd like. There's a solution to this though in the die set, a background die to cut and add to the lettering to help it stand out. I die cut the background piece from vellum. This enables the sentiment to stand its ground while not being too dominant. Being semi-translucent, the vellum sort of melds into the background. I attached the die cut to the background piece with Gina K Connect glue and added an acrylic block to ensure the die cut stuck properly. While that was drying, I added foam tape to the background and adhered it to the card base. I then cut teeny tiny pieces of foam tape and added them to the vellum behind the lettering so they wouldn't be visible from the front. I then added the sentiment to the card. Finally, I added some powder puff sequins from Little Things from Lucy's Cards. Oh, and I love these little triangle trays that Simon recently came out with. They help so much with digging around in the sequin mixers to get just the right sequin for what you want, and then their shape allows for easy pouring the sequins back into their bags or containers. I used Gina K Connect glue to keep the sequins in place, and that completes this card with a Saltwater Taffy ink blended soft floral background. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. On the Simon Says Stamp blog you'll find a coordinating blog post as well as details of the supplies I've used today. If you want to find me, I blog over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.